Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'll be your host for this week. As always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, I've been meaning to ask you, as the biggest baseball fan in my life, your opinions on Shohei Ohtani, who is drawing comparisons to Babe Ruth with his exploits both as pitcher and as hitter. And it should be worth noting, against a caliber of player, which is probably quite a bit higher than what Babe Ruth was facing in 1927. So I'm wondering, as a huge baseball fan, do you feel like you are witnessing Ruthian-level exploits?
Absolutely, yes. This guy is one of a kind. Up until Ohtani joined the game, I would have said, without question, Babe Ruth is the greatest player in baseball history. And I think he may still be, but Ohtani has definitely a threat to surpass him. You know, in fairness to Ruth, he really wasn't allowed to pitch and hit together in the same season.
Yeah.
He clearly could have done it.
Yeah.
He was the best left-handed pitcher in the major leagues before he switched to hitting. And we know he became the greatest power hitter in the history of the game. So he could have done it. He wasn't allowed to. Ohtani's being allowed to do it. And I think not only is that a sign of his greatness, but I predict it's going to lead to many more players who are doing both. Maybe not at the level of Ohtani, but I think it's going to become more common in the future.
Yeah, which brings to mind, I believe in college, you and I discussed whether Dave Winfield was a player who should have been allowed to both pitch and hit. Do you remember that conversation?
Oh, I sure do. Yes, he was a pitcher in college and a damn good one, too. So, yes. It's about time, right? What was that, 40 years ago we're having that conversation and they finally got around to it?
We are so far ahead of the time, Joe. If only people would start listening, for crying out loud.
Well, now they can hear us because we have a podcast. Before, they would have had to be in the next dorm room to hear us.
Yeah, following us around on the streets of Chicago.
Yes.
Well, I don't have a seamless transition into this week's topic, so let's just jump into it. So the term UBI is something I've heard bandied about recently, and it's usually in connection with people discussing what we can do about large-scale job displacements from things like AI and automation. And UBI stands for Universal Basic Income. And my understanding is the basic idea is that every single citizen in the United States or wherever you live would receive a check, and everyone from Bill Gates down to the homeless guy on the street would get exactly the same check. And that this would be enough money to keep you out of poverty. And so it'd be just the state providing you with a baseline level of existence. And then what you do after that is up to you. Maybe you work in a high-powered job. Maybe you paint. Maybe you work part-time or seasonally. But basically the idea of the UBI is it takes poverty and unemployment out of the equation, which allows for things like automation to displace workers without necessarily creating social unrest. I think it's an interesting idea. I have questions about how feasible it is, so I sent you down this rabbit hole, and I'd love to hear what you found.
Yeah, it's a great question, and your quickie summary is basically correct. I'm going to go into much more granular detail, but you have the basics right. Quick programming note before we begin, though, Mark. I'm thinking that some of our listeners may have tuned into this UBI episode expecting us to talk about unexplained beer injuries.
Oh,
but
yeah,
we're going to be talking about that other UBI today.
Yes. Also not talking about unexplained bowel injuries. That would be a separate topic.
Yes. But I think we agree that mansplaining listeners have a right to an explanation about unexplained beer and bowel injuries. So we pledge to bring you an episode on that soon.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We are duty bound.
Yes. Okay, let's start with the obvious first question. What is UBI? Universal Basic Income is a regular cash payment unconditionally delivered to all citizens. Its primary purpose is to reduce poverty. The money for UBI comes out of tax revenues. Payments go to individuals as opposed to households. Every individual gets the same amount. UBI payments are not one-time grants. They're made periodically, for example, monthly or yearly. They're made in cash so that recipients can use them however they wish. How much money is paid out depends on how the UBI program is structured. It can be a fixed amount or a percentage of the country's or the state's or the city's gross domestic product. But it's meant to provide a subsistence-level foundation. Depending on how it's implemented, UBI can either supplement other social welfare payments like Social Security, Medicaid, food stamps, or Section 8 housing vouchers, or it can replace them altogether. And crucially, UBI payments are unconditional, meaning that you don't have to meet any work requirements or means testing to get them, other than being a citizen.
Yeah.
Now, basic income supplements earmarked to particular groups date back at least to ancient Persia. The Romans distributed grain subsidies to poor residents. But those payments were not universal. The earliest prototype for UBI I could find was instituted by none other than Julius Caesar. In 46 BC, Caesar gave each common Roman citizen 100 denarii to commemorate a military victory. And after his assassination 2 years later, Caesar's will left an additional 75 denarii to each citizen. After Caesar's time, UBI pops up periodically in history. For example, the English philosopher Thomas More, in his 1516 book Utopia, contemplated a society in which every person received a guaranteed income. In 1797, the American pamphleteer and founding father Thomas Paine proposed a universal social insurance system comprising old age pensions and disability support, as well as universal stakeholder grants for young adults funded by a 10% inheritance tax. But support for UBI really started to pick up in the 20th century, primarily in the UK. Notwithstanding that history, as far as I can tell, Mark, there really hasn't been a full-fledged UBI program enacted anywhere at any time in world history. And by full-fledged, I mean one that was sustained for a while and sufficient to meet the basic needs of an entire population. UBI is more of a theoretical construct than a real-world program, so we can't definitively prove or disprove whether it works. A few countries have implemented basic income programs, but they're not true UBI because they don't target the entire population and they don't pay out enough to meet basic needs. Iran is one example. It offers monthly cash transfers amounting to 29% of median household income, about $1.50 per day. And according to UNICEF, its program significantly reduced hunger and poverty without reducing the labor supply.
Yeah.
Macau, a special administrative region of China, has a wealth partaking scheme in which every resident receives a yearly payment, but it's only a fraction of the income required to meet basic needs. And here in the U.S., Alaska established the Alaska Permanent Fund, which gives all residents of that state an annual dividend from the state's oil revenues. In 2021, the payment was $1,114. Not enough to serve as basic income, but according to the University of Alaska, it was enough to keep 15,000 to 25,000 Alaskans out of poverty.
Yeah.
Not coincidentally, Alaska is the state with the lowest income inequality in the country. In addition to these established programs, there have also been temporary UBI experiments conducted in recent years in places like Brazil, Finland, India, Kenya, Uganda, Namibia, the Canadian city of Vancouver, the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba, and the cities of Stockton and Compton, California, Tacoma, Washington, up in your backyard, and Chicago, Illinois. Most have met with some success. Namibia's basic income grant, implemented between 2007 and 2009, cut its poverty rate in half. Brazil's Bolsa Familia program cut its poverty rate by more than 75% from 2003 to 2015. UBI, or something resembling it, has gained adherents in recent years. The labor leader Andy Stern, the Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes, and the entrepreneur Andrew Yang all wrote books about it. Yang ran for president in 2020, proposing a freedom dividend of $1,000 per month for every American adult. Former President Obama mentioned UBI approvingly in a 2018 speech. In response to the harm done to workers by the COVID pandemic, Pope Francis said that, quote, "This may be the time to consider a universal basic wage," end quote. And this past February, Senator Cory Booker and Representative Ayanna Pressley reintroduced the American Opportunity Accounts Act, often referred to as baby bonds, legislation to create a federally funded savings account for every child in America with $1,000 at birth and subsequent deposits based on family income, with the express goal of making economic opportunity real for everyone and to help close the racial wealth gap.
Yeah.
However, among ordinary Americans, UBI isn't very popular, at least not yet. Both Gallup in 2019 and Pew Research in 2020 measured support for it at less than 50%, with older Americans and Republicans, I know that's redundant, particularly likely to oppose it. Such opposition means that UBI is unlikely to become law anytime soon. But like universal health insurance, Obamacare, if UBI is ever enacted, it's likely to become very popular.
Right. Though no doubt vilified on Fox News. And I think that ties into our nation's long, long history of identifying poverty with immorality, where you are a bad person if you're poor.
Yes.
At some point, we should do an episode on prosperity gospel, which is this strain of thought where the thinking is that God simply favors you with wealth. And so if you're not favored with wealth, then God is not shining his light on you. And it's just this very old, very deeply ingrained American tradition of thinking that if you're poor, there's a reason that you're poor, and you should stay poor until you figure that out about yourself and change.
Yes.
So, yeah, it would be very, very controversial within certain parts of our country.
Yes. But like Obamacare, I think if it were to ever pass, it would quickly become pretty damn popular in this country.
Sure. Yeah. People do like getting money in the mail.
Yeah. Despite there being no perfect dictionary definition UBI program I could find anywhere in the world, all the temporary experiments and half measures I just mentioned have taught us a lot about the potential pros and cons of UBI. So since that's really what you asked me about, Mark, I'm going to present two lists for you now before giving you my opinion. And I warn you in advance that they're both long and the list of pros outnumbers the list of cons. So let's start with the pros.
Okay.
First and foremost, UBI has the potential to eliminate poverty. Just think about that. Imagine finishing the work of the New Deal and the Great Society. It's every liberal's dream. Using data for 2022, a monthly cash payment of about $1,135 for every adult and $395 for every child would lift every American's income above the poverty level. If we could somehow find the resources and the national will to do that, it would solve one of our country's most vexing problems and lead to better life prospects for millions of Americans.
Yeah. And all the shadow effects of poverty.
Yes.
Like infant mortality and bad child outcomes and crime and
yes.
hopelessness and despair and the social unrest that come out of those things. It could have enormous follow-on effects.
Yes, cascading effects. And I'm going to talk about a couple of those coming up because I told you we got a long list of pros. Closely related to UBI's potential to eliminate poverty are, you guessed it, Mark, better health outcomes for people receiving the benefit.
Mhm.
If you haven't noticed, being poor is bad for your health in numerous ways. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, poor people have shorter lifespans, suffer from higher death rates from all causes, and are at greater risk of developing mental illness and chronic diseases such as obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. UBI alleviates these problems by improving nutrition and access to health care.
And also access to better food, because presumably in a UBI environment, Whole Foods would be more likely to put a store in a poor neighborhood.
Yes. UBI also increases educational opportunities by making it easier for teenagers to finish high school and for adults to take time off from work to attend college or graduate school, which ultimately boosts their job prospects and their wages. UBI reduces income and gender inequality, two of the most pressing social justice problems in the United States right now. Imagine if the working poor were able to pursue college degrees and increase their future earnings instead of being forced to quit school to find work. Because women continue to make less money than men, UBI payments would increase their incomes by a larger percentage. And let's talk for a minute about the caregiving work done disproportionately by women. UBI supports caregivers by providing a source of income for all the unpaid work they do. Whether it's mothers staying home to raise young children instead of paying thousands of dollars per year for daycare, or women caring for aging parents instead of paying thousands per month to long-term care providers, UBI makes it easier for all those unsung heroes, those exploited women, to manage their lives.
Yeah. It's a check that would be meaningless to Jeff Bezos, but would make a huge difference to people who are on the edge.
Absolutely. Let me go on with this list. UBI helps victims of domestic violence, many of whom report that they stay in dysfunctional relationships because they lack the means to support themselves or their children. UBI gives them an independent source of income that just might enable them to leave their abusers. UBI may indirectly raise wages in the same way that the pandemic shift to remote work led to the Great Resignation. If people feel more secure about their finances, they will quit working at unrewarding jobs to pursue better opportunities. Because the jobs they vacated still need to be performed, employers will have to raise wages to attract applicants.
Yeah.
In addition, when workers have more money in their pockets, they spend more, which boosts the economy and leads to more job creation, which further tightens the labor market and drives up wages.
As we talked about in our previous episode on Keynesian economics and deficit spending.
Yes. UBI protects the labor force from economic shocks. As you noted in your question, there's a debate happening right now about whether AI-induced automation will displace millions of workers, as per the predictions of people like Andrew Yang, Elon Musk, Richard Branson, and Sam Altman. Whether or not that comes to pass, UBI would certainly help workers deal with the inevitable dislocations related to technological churn. And it's worth considering that if UBI had been in place when the COVID pandemic struck, Congress wouldn't have needed to pass anything close to the $5 trillion in stimulus given to displaced workers and industries.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking of it. Forget about huge bailouts and just do tiny little individual citizen bailouts on a monthly basis.
Yeah, right. And while we're talking about saved money, UBI cuts a lot of red tape. Compared to other government programs which have eligibility or spending limits, are often unavailable to the unemployed or those with variable income, and for which 10% of spending covers administrative costs, UBI is blissfully simple to run. Because it's universal, there's no need to determine who's eligible for payments. Recipients get their money automatically, and they spend it however they choose. They don't have to navigate all those often infuriating bureaucracies, which both improves access and lessens the workload of government administrators. And of course, nearly all the money goes directly to recipients.
Yeah.
UBI eliminates the social stigma of welfare. Many people are reluctant to sign up for or accept benefits because of the perceived shame of taking a handout. This is a real phenomenon that inhibits many people from claiming benefits to which they are entitled. But UBI is universal and everyone gets it, which removes that stigma.
Yeah. That brings to mind a short story I read way back when I was in middle school, where I believe the title was Not Poor, Just Broke, where it was a man writing about when he was a child in the inner city within a slum. And through some special program, he was given a coat for the winter. And this coat was bright orange. And he was deeply ashamed of the coat because it was like a badge of poverty. So he threw it away. And his mother was furious with him that he had thrown away this coat that was going to keep him warm. And she couldn't afford to buy him one. And his stance was that coat's for poor people. Well, we're not poor, we're just broke. So speaking to what you're talking about there, the stigma of being on welfare, being on food stamps, you take that away because it's just money that absolutely everybody gets and you got to spend it.
Yeah. Boy, that's an interesting story. It sounds like I'd love you to dig up that for me. All right, I got a couple more pros before we get to the cons. UBI ends quote-unquote welfare traps. Most government-run social welfare programs offer benefits only to people who earn below certain income thresholds, which has the effect of discouraging people from getting better jobs or working more hours for fear that they lose their benefits without fully replacing the assistance provided. UBI eliminates that perverse disincentive to better one's work. Recipients are free to work and earn as much as they can. And finally, UBI encourages entrepreneurship by giving people an income base to fall back on should they want to take risks like starting a business. Traditional benefit programs don't help with such transitions because most self-employed workers are ineligible for them. Mark Zuckerberg addressed this very issue in a Harvard commencement speech he gave in 2017, where he said he wouldn't have been able to start Facebook without his affluent family's financial safety net, and he argued that UBI would give people, quote, a cushion to try new things, end quote.
Yeah. Bill Gates' parents were wealthy as well. It's a huge leg up in the world.
Yes.
It's not that they accomplished those things simply because they came from wealthy families, but that being talented and also wealthy is a huge advantage over people who are merely talented and not at all wealthy.
Yes. So maybe a minimum base income will encourage other people to take the plunge and work on their dreams like that. So those are a lot of good reasons for UBI. I think you would agree.
Yeah.
But there are also some downsides, so let's get to them. Most obviously, UBI's universality is a double-edged sword in that it's enormously expensive. I mentioned a few minutes ago that Ontario, Canada tried UBI. Their trial, which covered only 4,000 people, ended prematurely because of what officials called its extraordinary cost. Indeed, a UBI program like the one proposed by Andrew Yang that would provide $1,000 per month, $12,000 per year, to every adult citizen in America, that's nearly 260 million people, by the way, would cost over $3 trillion per year to maintain, which is more than half the entire federal budget for calendar year 2022.
Yeah. Even
so, Yang's plan would still fall short of the 2022 federal poverty level, which is $13,590 per year for individuals. The Urban Institute estimates that we can offset about $483 billion of that $3 trillion by eliminating other social welfare programs. But if a $12,000 annual UBI stipend still leaves many Americans in poverty, it might not make sense to get rid of those other programs.
Yeah.
Raising income taxes back to 1950s levels might cover the shortfall, but how likely is that to happen?
Not at all.
Yeah. And surveying proposed UBI plans in the USA and 5 European nations in 2017, Oxford economist John Kay found that, quote, either the level of basic income is unacceptably low or the cost of providing it is unacceptably high, end quote.
Yeah. One partial solution that I have heard floated is that companies that lay off employees in favor of automation would continue to pay unemployment insurance for those people in perpetuity, basically, so that companies would be taxed for the privilege of laying people off. But that's unlikely to get us to UBI levels where there's a check for absolutely everybody. It would simply be a payout for people who had been displaced from the market.
That's interesting. I wasn't focusing particularly on the dislocations caused by AI and automation, so I didn't catch that particular solution. But that is interesting. UBI is also wildly inefficient and arguably wasteful in that many payments will go to people who don't need them. Here's an interesting way to look at that. If our country took all the money it now spends on aid programs and apportioned it equally to the entire population, the effect would be a reverse Robin Hood in which we essentially rob the poor to help the middle and upper classes. Of course, targeting the UBI benefit to those who need it would cost much less. And I'll say more about that shortly. But then it wouldn't be universal, so it wouldn't really be UBI anymore.
Yeah. And per your earlier point, you would suddenly have a lot of administrative costs of people determining and reassessing eligibility.
Yes.
So you would have a very large department of payout with people drawing salaries and computer systems that you'd have to pay for.
Yeah.
And you'd lose some of the benefit that way.
Yeah.
It also occurs to me that maybe the primary benefit of sending a check to absolutely everybody, Bill Gates included, is that it's an easier sell politically because we're not arguing to the middle class that we need another program for the poor. It's just, this is a program for everybody, and so it's more inclusive and maybe easier for people who might be dubious about it to accept it.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more, and I have more to say about that at the end, so hold that thought and we'll get back to it in a few minutes. But on with the cons, the anti-UBI arguments. UBI might lead to inflation. Like any major fiscal stimulus, UBI would likely exert upward pressure on prices for labor and housing costs specifically, and that could be inflationary.
Yeah. That was my number one question going into this podcast. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yes.
In our previous episode, we talked about economists discussing how when the government injects money into the economies, and UBI would be a massive injection of money into the economy, how that's an inflationary pressure. And that they have things like interest rates to rein inflation back, but that is not an absolute power. It's a little bit limited. So you would definitely have to tackle the inflation question at some point if you were to institute this.
Absolutely. UBI also doesn't address the root causes of poverty. People living in poverty often suffer from poor physical health or mental health. They may have addiction issues. They probably lack education and skills, or all of the above. Handing them money doesn't solve those deeper problems. Many advocates for the poor argue that aid programs targeting their problems would help them far more than cash assistance. That said, some of the existing UBI experiments have shown that recipients tend to invest in resources that help them earn more money, and their kids tend to stay in school longer, which helps to raise the next generation out of poverty. In other words, money may not address root causes, but it still helps.
Yeah. And it occurs to me that this intersects unexpectedly with an even earlier episode of this podcast when we talked about whether charity is better giving money to foundations or giving money directly to the recipients. And I think in that podcast, we kind of came down on the side of giving money directly to recipients. So is it better to provide money to a social service like food stamps, or is it better to give money to people so they can buy food?
Yes.
And generally speaking, I think the trend these days is to think the latter comes out ahead.
Yeah, but unquestionably, this would be a debate that would happen if UBI became an actual possibility on the political horizon.
Sure.
So UBI may indirectly lower wages. I know I just told you that UBI might indirectly raise wages, but there are plausible arguments on both sides. So in fairness, here's the negative argument. If UBI gives people a base of enough money to live on, then employers will have an excuse to pay workers less than a living wage. This is already starting to happen in the gig economy, where many gig workers are willing to accept low wages because they have other sources of income. We'll need further studies to see who's right, but if the naysayers are right, the government could always raise the minimum wage to compensate for the wage-depressing effects of UBI.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
It makes me think of when I was trying to freelance as an editor, and there are some online freelance markets for writers and editors, and I found them to be just deeply depressing.
Yes.
Because there were so many people who were willing to work for free because they wanted to get their foot in the door.
Yes.
And I was not looking to work for free. I needed to make money to pay rent. And so if you have a UBI where you've got the money for rent and food, then it could, in fact, drive the real wage down because there are more people who are willing to accept less.
Yeah, that's a good point. What I was just saying was more about the example of the person who's willing to string together 2 or 3 very poorly paying jobs to make ends meet for them. And that just gives employers carte blanche to charge crappy wages because there are people who are willing to work 2 or 3 jobs at crappy wages. But here's one objection, Mark, I think we'll all recognize. You almost touched on it a couple minutes ago. Some opponents of UBI argue that the unconditional nature of UBI payments discourages work, promotes laziness, and diminishes self-worth.
Yeah.
In other words, if you give people money without any strings attached, they have no incentive to engage in productive work, which is not good for them or for the economy. Does that sound familiar?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've been hearing that all my life.
Yeah, I recall Archie Bunker making that argument on TV 50 years ago. Senator Joe Manchin made a similar argument much more recently when he voted against President Biden's proposal to extend the child tax credit in 2021. But unlike the first few con arguments, which I think are really strong ones, this argument is easily rebuttable. Most UBI proposals pay just enough money for people to survive on, precisely so they are still incentivized to work. Evidence from the limited UBI experiments conducted around the world shows no overall decrease in working. For example, according to a 2018 paper by the National Bureau of Economic Research, payouts from the Alaska Permanent Fund I mentioned earlier led to no reduction in full-time employment and a slight increase in part-time employment in that state.
Yeah.
And again, that's because UBI is meant to provide a subsistence-level base of income upon which people are supposed to build. And most people will still be strongly incentivized to work and raise their standard of living.
Sure.
And as for the diminished self-worth, I suspect workers who clean toilets for a living might beg to differ that the UBI that allows them to quit that god-awful job is anything other than a godsend.
Yeah. Though it does raise the question of, in the presence of UBI, who's going to be doing the god-awful jobs?
Yeah. But as I mentioned earlier in the pros section, the employers of those jobs will simply have to raise the wages if they want those toilets cleaned, and that benefits everybody.
Good point. Yeah. I personally have to say that I believe in the power of marketing to overcome those objections, which is that marketing does such a good job of making us want things, to want bigger and better and brighter and newer, to go on that vacation and drive that car and own that home.
Yes.
And all those things. Very few of us are willing to settle for the absolute minimum. The only people who settle for the absolute minimum today are people who are already working their fingers to the bone to get up to that minimum.
Yeah.
They're not there because they like it. They're there because there aren't enough hours in the day to get past it.
Right. Yeah. So before we get to our opinions at the end, there's one more thing I want you to indulge me on, and I want to mention a couple of overlapping alternatives to UBI. Spend a few minutes talking about them before I get to my conclusions. Guaranteed minimum income is an umbrella term for the many ways that payments are made to people in need, ranging from unemployment insurance to disability payments to educational grants to pension plans. It's cheaper than UBI, but much tougher to administer because of the need to means test recipients. There are countless methods for implementing guaranteed minimum income. One relatively recent idea that I want to shine a light on today, first proposed in the 1940s, it's called the negative income tax, in which if your income is below a certain level, instead of paying the tax man, you receive money on April 15th. The less you make, the more you get. People with zero income receive the maximum benefit. I was surprised to learn that one of the early champions of negative income tax was the conservative economist Milton Friedman. In 2015, the Journal of Poverty published a provocative paper arguing that the U.S. could eliminate poverty through a negative income tax, and the cost would be only $309 billion per year in 2022 dollars. That's about a tenth of the $3 trillion annual cost of a full-fledged UBI program. Given that we currently spend about $360 billion per year on the bulk of our welfare spending, and that's comprised of the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, supplemental security income, SNAP, housing vouchers, and the school lunch program, you can make an argument that an effective negative income tax plan might save money while simultaneously doing more to combat poverty. And it just might attract enough Republican votes to pass Congress because it shrinks the size of government, which is something conservatives profess to support, at least when they're not trying to use state and local governments to prosecute abortion providers or trans people.
Yeah.
We tried a version of guaranteed minimum income during the Nixon administration, which unveiled its family assistance plan in August 1969, crafted by urban affairs advisor and later Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. President Nixon described it as, quote, a national floor under incomes for working or dependent families, end quote. It was intended to replace the program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which is more commonly known as welfare. It wasn't UBI because there were strings attached. To qualify for benefits, you had to be willing to work or enter a training program. By 1975, Nixon's plan had evolved into the earned income tax credit we have today, in which refundable tax credits are provided to low and moderate income individuals and couples with children. The earned income tax credit is lauded by economists across the ideological spectrum as a particularly effective program, and it enjoys strong bipartisan support even in today's polarized Congress. It's essentially a modest version of the negative income tax. Unfortunately, it's no longer a robust guaranteed minimum income plan because it's not available to everyone in need, nor does it provide enough money to live on. But if we could somehow scale it up to the level imagined by the Journal of Poverty study, it might be a life-changing intervention for millions of Americans.
Yeah.
So there's a problem with guaranteed minimum income plans that we really haven't discussed yet, which is that they tend to be unpopular with the American people because of perceived unfairness. You touched on this a minute ago, and now I want to give this a fuller hearing. Like it or not, people just don't support programs where the money or advantage goes only to some people, even if they're the people who most need it. Social Security is enormously popular because everybody gets it. Like Social Security, UBI ensures that everyone has a sufficient financial basis upon which to build their lives. And with less financial pressure, people can find work that suits their interests and skills. By contrast, according to polling at least, the constituencies for two recent programs that were adversely decided by the Supreme Court, namely student loan forgiveness and affirmative action, are much smaller and nowhere near a majority. And that is surely because they're not universal. So, based on all that, Mark, here's my take on what I just presented, and then I'm really anxious to hear yours. I think America's money is better invested in people than in weapons systems or corporate welfare, just to name two of the many entrenched interests competing for federal dollars.
Yeah.
I think our goal should be to create thriving citizens who contribute to the general welfare and who are not chronically hampered by the money woes that lead directly to medical, educational, and ultimately psychological deficits. If you want to have citizens who ultimately make more than they take, to use a locution that's popular with some Republicans, you have to invest in those citizens. And it seems like a no-brainer to me that direct cash assistance is a really good way to do that. But for me, your question ultimately boils down to whether textbook UBI, in which not only poor people, but also, like you mentioned, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Taylor Swift, LeBron James, and Jared Kushner also receive the benefit. Is that the best way to proceed? And here, I'm just not sure. A more targeted intervention like the negative income tax strikes me as the more intellectually sensible path. It would provide many of the same benefits as UBI, like reducing poverty and streamlining government bureaucracy, but at a much more reasonable cost because of its less ambitious scale. It might also have a better chance of passing Congress. But gaining passage and gaining acceptance are two very different things. And I wonder whether any guaranteed minimum income plan that targets some but not all will have the staying power that comes only with acceptance by the American people. Like Social Security and Medicare before it, UBI's universality might be its ticket to that kind of acceptance. Hearing all this, what's your sense, Mark?
I think you're probably right with that final thought. I think there's a deeply American belief, something we cling desperately to, which is that we are or should be all exactly alike.
Yes.
You know, that one nation under God sort of thing.
Yes.
Despite our many differences, our many obvious differences, entrenched differences that we protect.
We should be a colorblind nation. Yeah, this is the Supreme Court just saying that.
Yeah, there's an ideology of a level playing field where things like Social Security, where the payout goes to absolutely everybody, that just seems more American in a certain way. And so I do think that UBI just, since everyone gets it, you'll see your check in the mail, it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from, I just think that probably solves better. I do wonder, as someone who lives in a fairly expensive community, about the effects of basic cost of living on UBI, where a $1,200 check in rural Oklahoma is going to mean a lot more than a $1,200 check in Seattle, but that actually might play into its political favorability.
Yes.
Because, of course, the majority of Republican voters are poor, and many of them are rural, living in communities where money goes much further than it does in New York City or San Francisco or Seattle or Chicago. And so maybe this is something where an ostensibly Democratic candidate could play to the Republican base by just speaking in real terms about how far this check will go within their communities.
Yeah, I think your thought process right there mimics kind of where I was going at the end. Logically, targeting the income to need just seems like the way to go, but I wonder whether it's politically sustainable. And what you just said kind of illustrates how we can imagine passing UBI because all those people in rural communities are going to get that same $1,000 or $1,200 a month will be clamoring for it to their Republican representatives, which makes it an easier sell than Cory Booker's baby bonds, even though there's a logic to Cory Booker's baby bonds that is unimpeachable, in my opinion.
Right. I also think that if one were in charge of selling this to a nation, it would be worth thinking about where the ROI is. And we talked about it a little bit here in terms of you could scale down things like welfare and food stamps, and that money goes towards the new program. But It is, like you pointed out, a very expensive program. And so on some level, I think you would need to think through and address the question of ultimately, where does the money go? And if the answer to that is the money goes to not feeling bad about high infant mortality in poor communities, maybe that's the answer. But for the more hard-hearted members of our great republic, I think it would be useful to try to think in terms of quantifying what the real outcome might be if suddenly entrepreneurship explodes across the country because people had the freedom to found their own companies.
Yes.
Or if the economy goes through a transformation because suddenly everyone can freelance within the thing that they're most talented and best equipped to pursue. It just present the outcomes. Because you never want to present people with the bill and say, okay, this is going to be expensive, but it's worth it. You need always, with things like this, to talk about what are the amazing outcomes we're going to arrive at and sell the emotion of that outcome, and then maybe you'll make some headway.
Yes, agreed. And also hammering home the point that investing in people has a built-in ROI that's through the roof, you know? Every study ever done of Head Start programs and things like that indicate that every dollar you spend is multiple dollars returned to you in the form of a functioning adult, educated adult who's maximizing his or her potential. And that's just such an American thing, you know, investing in our people. It could really be a rah-rah type of thing that we rally around. After we have the Civil War, right? Maybe this is the solution after the Civil War. I tried my best to give you both sides of the coin, and it sounds like both of us favor some kind of cash assistance, and our political instincts lean in the direction of UBI. Does that sound accurate to you?
Yeah, it does. And in the climate that we live in, it kind of feels, at least from my perspective, almost inevitable perspective. I was hearing today about the writers' strike in Hollywood. I don't know if you've been following that.
Yeah.
But there was a story recently released on Deadline which says that a studio executive was quoted anonymously as saying that their tactic was to let the strike drag on long enough for the writers to start to lose their homes, because that would then bring them back in enough of a humble mindset that the studios could get the deal that they want.
Yeah.
And as long as capitalism is that predatory, then we cannot count on the business community to provide for us. We need governments to fill in the gap because capitalism has decided that it is an instrument for the 1%, for the executive class. And the outcome is an executive who makes $30 million and an employee base who are scrabbling just to make ends meet.
Yep.
And that's not a future that any of us want to live in. And UBI would present a different kind of future.
Yep. I'm with you all the way on that. And just on the writer's strike, now that the actors are out, I think it's much more likely that it's the producers who are going to come with tails between legs to grovel and work out a deal.
Right. They can ignore the faceless writers, but when Tom Cruise is on the picket lines, they don't like that at all.
Right. All right. I have a question for you for next time. You ready for this?
I am.
All right. I think we'll leave unexplained beer and bowel injuries unexplained for a little longer.
Keep people in suspense.
Yes. I have something else in mind for next time. I want to talk about the weather. As you know, various parts of our country have been plagued by smoke from out-of-control wildfires for several years now. In fact, one of the first episodes we did of this podcast 3 full years ago was about wildfires.
Right.
And as we speak in mid-July 2023, the entire southern tier of our country is baking in a dangerous and unremitting heat wave. This past Sunday, 8 inches of rain fell in less than 2 hours not far from me in New York. What I'm hearing and reading from climate scientists is that they're not surprised about these particulars, but they're stunned at how quickly they're coming to pass. Our climate catastrophe appears to be arriving way ahead of schedule. My question to you, Mark, is this. What's the weather forecast for the USA going forward? Is there a chance that vast swaths of our country will become unlivable in our lifetimes?
Okay, that will be a fun one. Really looking forward into looking into that dystopia. But sure, I'll dive in and I'll see what I can find.
Yeah. I mean, it's the news of our lives every day. I feel like we can't avoid talking about this subject, even though it is dark.
Yeah. Okay, so tune in 2 weeks from now, folks, to find out if Joe's New York City will soon be under like 6 feet of water.
Yeah.
That's the end of this week's episode. If you would like to follow up on any of the sources that Joe used and research this, or ask us a question or leave a comment, you can do that on our Facebook page. You can find it, Mansplaining the Podcast. It's a great place to check out what we've been publishing, follow up on our sources, even propose a topic for a future episode. We also have a second measure by which you can propose another episode, which is that you can leave us a voicemail at the number 206-486-4074. Operators are standing by.
Yes.
Actually, they're not. It's a Google Voice number, but we will hear your voicemail and we will consider your question. If you'd like to help spread the good news of Mansplaining the Podcast, the best way to do that is by way of your podcast platform of choice. Maybe that's Google Play, maybe it's Spotify, maybe it's Apple, maybe it's Amazon, maybe it's something I've never even heard of. You can look us up on that platform. You can find the listing for our podcast, and there you can give us a rating and a review. 5 stars help people understand that Mansplaining is awesome.
Yeah.
And your review helps people understand why it's awesome.
We've done more than 70 episodes now, folks, but don't feel like you have to binge all of them. Find the topics you're most interested in. Listen to those first.
Yeah. The Christmas episode is a great one. The QAnon episode was a great one.
Yeah.
We did a really good episode on the calendar system and how it all goes back to Julius Caesar.
Yes.
So find the one that speaks to you and speak it up. But that's it for this week. And we do appreciate that you spent some time with us. That was Joe, and I'm Mark, and we'll see you next time.
Talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.